So we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Karen Kiefer, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Church in the 21st Century Center. And I see a lot of students here, and you might not know what the Church in the 21st Century Center is, but our whole mission is to be a catalyst and a resource for the renewal of the Catholic Church. And this year we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, if you can believe it. And we're inviting back a lot of friends and speakers that have been a part of our journey to be that catalyst. And of course, Ambassador Hackett is one of those. So we're pleased to have him here tonight and excited that you get a chance to kind of be in conversation with him. That said, it's autumn and it's so beautiful outside. And I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to just open up with an autumn prayer. So, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God of creation, you have blessed us with the changing of the seasons. As we welcome the autumn months, may the earlier setting of the sun remind us to take time to rest. May the brilliant colors of the leaves remind us of the wonder of your creation. May the steam of the breath in the cool air remind us that it is you who gives us the breath of life. May the harvest from the fields remind us of the abundance we have been given and the bounty we are to share with others. May the dying of summer spirit remind us of your great promise that death is temporary and life is eternal. We praise you for your goodness forever and ever. Amen. Happy October. So I have the great privilege to introduce not only one of my colleagues, Peter Martin, but also a Boston College alum who happens to be Ambassador Ken Hackett. You all have received a bio of Ambassador Hackett that will kind of detail his journey. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction and then open it up to Peter. He's going to be in conversation with Ambassador Hackett, and then they're going to talk for 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to you. So be thinking about some questions that you'd like to ask Ambassador Hackett. So Peter, he served as a U.S. diplomat in the diplomatic corps for 23 years and was a political advisor to 3 ambassadors at the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See, including Ambassador Hackett. He became special assistant to BC's president, Father William P. Leahy, in 2019. He also teaches a class on Vatican diplomacy in BC's International Studies program, and he also chairs the steering committee of the Church in the 21st Century Center. Ambassador Hackett. He served as a U.S. ambassador to the Holy See from 2013 until his retirement in January of 2017. He previously was the president of the Catholic Relief Services from 2003 until his 2011 retirement, having served at CRS as an executive director since 1993. Ambassador Hackett began his career at CRS in 1972, serving throughout Asia and Africa, and was a leader in the organization's response in 1984 to 1985 to the Ethiopian famine and the crisis in Somalia in the early 1990s. He has advised the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on migration and international policy issues, and was a member of the board of the Pontifical Commission of Cor Unum. He has received, listen to this, 19 honorary degrees, including one from his alma mater, Boston College, in 2006. What have you not done? Anyway, take it away, Peter.
Thank you, Karen. Am I okay? Hear me okay? Thanks very much, and my welcome also to Ambassador Hackett. It's my nearly 3 years working with Ambassador Hackett at the U.S. Embassy was one of the highlights of my diplomatic career, so to have him here and to be able to speak with him is a great pleasure for me. And I think for us also, we get some high-level speakers here, but to have one like you who is also an alumnus, it's great to have so many students here to know that you're walking the same corridors, some of them, that he walked. And we had a nice walk around campus today. And I think some of it's changed, but some of it still looks familiar.
Yeah, a lot has changed, believe me. It's a magnificent campus. It was a simple campus when I was here, but it's magnificent now.
So could you tell us, at what point during your Boston College career did you start thinking about doing international work of some sort?
Carmen, can I tell the story? Yes, you may. Carmen and I were part of the same fraternity, and we both played lacrosse together, and we're good friends. And we're walking one day in probably April of '68 from Fulton to McElroy to have lunch, and there's a table set up in the foyer of McElroy saying, "Sign up for the Peace Corps." That was the moment he said, "You want to sign up?" And I said, "Yeah." And there was not a lot of forethought to this process, but it sounded a lot better than Ford Motor Company or Esso or Edison Electric. So I did. And then a month later, we were at a social event, and I said to Carmen, "Did you get your offer from the Peace Corps today in the mail?" And he said, "Yeah, but I'm not going to the Peace Corps. I'm going to GE." So off I went to Ghana. So it wasn't really something that I had been pining for my 4 years at BC. I was more worried about lacrosse and getting a date and getting good marks than thinking about where I was going to be in my international career.
Right. But once you were in Ghana with the Peace Corps, you caught the bug for living overseas and
Very much caught
service.
It was a transformative experience for me to be totally in a different culture. Those of you who are from Boston know that we're pretty provincial. I'm from West Roxbury, and you didn't think much about going out of West Roxbury. Maybe you went down to Green Harbor in Marshfield, but that was the limit of what you traveled to. And there I was in a completely different culture with people who spoke a myriad of languages. But as I said to the ladies who were writing for the Heights, so many of those people that I met were very much like the people from West Roxbury in so many ways, once you understood them and got to appreciate their lives a little bit. So it was a great experience for me to spend 3.5 years in the Peace Corps.
And you write in the book that, in a way, your training for the job as ambassador began then, with the lessons you learned there and the experience you had.
Well, yeah, particularly in relation to dealing with different cultures, trying to convince somebody of a point in another language that you're not really fluent in. You have to use all your skills, and you really have to develop the relationships. And once you have the relationships developed, then you can see some changes happening.
Mm-hmm. And what was the transition like when you could talk maybe about your transition from the Peace Corps to CRS and how that developed your experience internationally?
I went from being a Peace Corps in Ghana to working for Catholic Relief Services in Sierra Leone, also in West Africa. The transition was quite easy. It was easy to pick up the language in Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, I had more management responsibility. We ran very nationwide maternal and child health programs, a nationwide leprosy program, all kinds of efforts to improve water systems. And so it was really, I could draw on some of my training here at BC in management and apply it, particularly as it related to people too. Motivating people was a big thing. We had staff of about 100 in Sierra Leone, and staff always are a challenge. But that's what we were taught here.
Sometimes they're a bonus, too.
Oh, wow, absolutely.
But sometimes a challenge. And then, so many times at the embassy, people would say to me, oh, Ambassador Hackett, he was a natural to be ambassador to the Holy See. He was a natural. It was a perfect choice. What kinds of experiences at CRS do you think helped really prepare you really well for that job?
Well, Catholic Relief Services had operations in 100 countries, and I traveled to most of them and had staff working in those countries and programs in those countries. So the Vatican is a global entity. It's unlike the government of Estonia or Burundi or the Philippines that focuses on its nation. The Vatican looks across the globe. And so to be able to have a cogent conversation with people in the Vatican about what was going on in Central Africa, and then in the afternoon have a conversation about what's going on in China, and then in the evening at the cocktail party that you had to go to, have another conversation about another part of the world or about another issue like human trafficking or human rights or religious freedom. You had to have that ability to move among topics. And the experience of Catholic Relief Services really gave me that ability.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of I think we'll talk more about your ambassadorship, but what were maybe a couple of the real highlights or greatest accomplishments that you had at CRS for those who haven't followed it?
Well, there was a lot of trauma at CRS. We dealt with trauma. So you mentioned the Ethiopia famine in 1984 to 85, 86. That was terrible, absolutely terrible. And then the Somali crisis that went on in the early 90s. But then the worst of them all was the genocide in Rwanda. And it happened on my watch. And we did not see it coming. And it caused a transformation of Catholic Relief Services from top to bottom. We just didn't see things the way we saw them before the genocide happened. And to give you a shorthand on that, we thought of ourselves as a relief and development organization of the Catholic Church. But we realized that what happened in Rwanda was a total breakdown of civil society. The relationships between people were not right. And that was the key between Hutu and Tutsi, between rich people and poor people. And it caused terrible, terrible violence and over 800,000 people to be massacred. And for us as an organization that dipped inside that country for many years, it forced us to rethink everything about how we approach life. There is a priest in the Archdiocese of Boston who teaches at Harvard in the Kennedy School, Father Brian Hare, if any of you know him. I brought him in as my advisor to help me think about how to apply Catholic social teaching in all its elements to the real world that Catholic Relief Services was working in, where real problems happen, and they're not just superficial things that you write books about. And it took us a long time, but I think we ingrained that in the organization. So that's a long-winded explanation.
No, I think it's important. I mean, I think that's, it seems, you knew the church well, you knew the bishops well, but you had been through all these experiences around the world that I think did make you a natural choice. And when I was reading the book, it was interesting to read about those small but important BC connections when, at the time of your selection, you mentioned that Father Leahy had a very small role, and Senator at the time, Kerry, who was BC law alumnus, as people probably know. How did that come out?
In January of 2013, I had to go in for an aortic valve replacement. I was playing squash and I felt dizzy, and my cardiologist said, if you feel dizzy, get in here. So I got into the hospital, had the valve replaced, was recovering in early February, and my wife took a call from Father Brian Hare. And she said, oh, Brian, Ken is recovering from a surgery. He said, don't worry, it's not important. 3 weeks later, I was talking to him, and he said, well, what I was going to tell you was that Senator Kerry called Father Leahy, let me see if I can get this right, yeah, called Father Leahy to see if it would be okay with Archbishop Sean O'Malley if Ken was appointed as ambassador to the Vatican. So the circle was squared, so to speak.
It always comes back to BC sooner or later.
Yeah, kind of.
And then in your confirmation hearing, you ended up seeing another familiar face.
So every ambassador has to be confirmed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And to prepare for that, you go through an all-day murder board where you sit in a room with about 30 staff and they start firing questions at you, everything you can imagine that they would think that the Senate might ask you, just so that you're prepared for it. And when I went through that, and then finally went in for the confirmation hearing, my wife and kids were there, and there were two other ambassadors, the ambassador designate to Austria and the ambassador designate to Italy, who were there for confirmation hearings. And we waited, and it was long after the hour that the hearing was scheduled for. But all of a sudden, who do I see walking in was Senator Ed Markey. You notice I pronounced the name correct, Markey. And he walked in, followed by Senator Kane from Virginia. And Senator Markey opened the hearing saying how pleased he was to be here at his first Senate confirmation hearing. He had just taken over from Senator Kerry, who had gone on to become the Secretary of State, and how pleased he was to be here with his college classmate, class of '68 in BC, Ken Hackett. I'm thinking, ooh, this is going to be easy. And then he turns it over to Senator Kane, and Senator Kane said how wonderful he thought it was to be there, to approve the ambassador to the Vatican under a Jesuit pope, because he had spent, during his time at Harvard Law School, 6 months working with the Jesuits in Guatemala. And I'm thinking, oh, I just hit this one out of the park. And indeed, they didn't ask any tough questions of me. They really beat up on the Italian ambassador. So
You went through ambassador school, and which they have this training program for the State Department, fondly known as ambassador school, and to get out to the Vatican. And you knew the church very well in many ways, but were there any surprises as you were getting settled and started to get to know the church from the Vatican perspective more than from the field?
Surprises. Right before we first went to Rome for the assignment as ambassador, President Obama had declared a red line relative to Syria. And I got there, I was due to get to Rome September 15th or so of 2013. The Pope Francis, had declared a worldwide day of prayer for peace in Syria, basically against Obama's red line. Red line was, if things go in this direction, the U.S. will attack. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be interesting. I have to defend the red line policy of the government, and I'm just arriving in the country. So that was kind of a shocker, and Indeed, it did work out well. I eventually brought General John Allen, who was in charge of U.S. Military and other operations in Syria for the U.S. government, to the Vatican to explain what U.S. position was going to be. And that was helpful. At least it calmed the fears that we were going to start bombing in Damascus. Maybe we should have, but anyway, it was a rough one. And there were many instances like that where we were able to bring people to the Vatican who could inform the bureaucracy or the curia in the Vatican about some of the important elements of our government policy. For instance, I invited Gina McCarthy from Dorchester. She was the energy secretary. And she came out twice, I think, to explain U.S. policy on energy and climate change and things like that. And we brought many a person. I mean, I knew nothing about nuclear nonproliferation, so we invited out the assistant secretary of that office in the State Department to explain what our position, U.S. position was on nuclear nonproliferation and other military things. And this was a way of maybe not convincing the people in the Vatican, but at least explaining our position. Because as ambassador, you don't know everything. And so it's best to use smart people when you can. Like Peter.
Getting, having those visitors come is one thing, but getting access for them and for yourself is another thing. And it seemed like even though you didn't have relationships with everyone who was in the Curia and the Vatican government, basically, you knew a lot of people and you had those relationships where they knew people who you knew well, and that helped a lot.
Absolutely. And from the very beginning, when you first get there, as ambassador, before you present your credentials to the Pope, that you are the official representative of the U.S. government, you really can't do any work with the Vatican. So you go around and you meet the other ambassadors. And one who was very helpful to me was the British ambassador, Nigel Baker, who I said, well, Nigel, how do you work here? There's no manual for the Vatican. Nobody explains to you what this office is versus that dicastery or that person who has the title assessore or substituto. How do you figure this all out? And he said, first, Ken, remember, it's not transactional. It's all relational. You have nothing to sell the Vatican, and they are not going to buy anything. You've got to get to know the actors and get to know them well before they'll start opening up. Because when you first go into some of the meetings in the Vatican, as Peter well knows better than I, you get this, well, Monsignor, tell me about this. Well, that might be difficult to explain. You get a lot of that kind of, we're not going to tell you anything. And you've really got to work the relationships so you get the information. And we did. We worked hard to open doors. We were talking the other day about an Irish priest who, when the Russians first invaded in 2014, when they invaded Ukraine, I knew very little about Ukraine. And so I was told, I don't know whether it was Peter, but somebody told me that this particular bishop was kind of an expert on Ukraine. But when I first met him, I said, can you tell me something, Bishop, about background on Ukraine and the fact that there's the Ukrainian Catholic Church and then there's the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and there's the Ukrainian Russian Catholic, Russian Church. It all seems very, very complicated. And he was one of those, well, I don't know much. And after 45 minutes in a graduate lecture course. I knew a lot more than I did. But that's the kind of thing to get those treasures, people who hold the treasure to open up and share with you the information and intelligence they have. And if you think about the Vatican a little bit as a global entity, they're fed a tremendous amount of information, not only from their own ambassadors or nuncios, but from all the bishops who have to report officially, from the heads of religious communities that are all based in Rome. And all this information goes up and is synthesized in various Vatican offices. So you really can learn an awful lot if you've got the right relationships there.
And I was impressed when you first met the Vatican foreign minister. At the time, it still is Archbishop Paul Gallagher. I mean, it's a good example of you can have a relationship with people in these offices, and they can do this much for you, or they can do this much for you. They can cooperate with you this much or that much. And you had a long history with him also, and ended up being a really good relationship that really moved the needle.
He's from Liverpool. And I said to him, Archbishop, this is when he first got there, he came in from Australia, and I said to him, Archbishop, we met before in Burundi when you went in to take over the embassy, the Vatican embassy, after the assassination of the previous archbishop there. And he said, no, Ken, we met before that in the Philippines, back in the 80s. And so our relationship went way back, and that pays. And we try to work as many of those kind of situations as we could.
So so many great parts of the book, but section that you have on President Obama's visit to the Vatican, I think is really revealing of how a visit is planned, all the behind the scenes things that go on. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges and some of the things that we had to deal with?
Everything about a presidential visit is negotiated. Everything. How many people are in the delegation? How many press people? Where will the helicopter land? What if we have to take the president out for a health emergency? Where are the phones? Which stairs can I go up if it's blocked? No guns. No guns allowed in the Vatican. You mean the Secret Service is not going to be allowed to carry it? No guns. So just on the gun thing. So when the final day came and we moved from where President Obama was staying to the Vatican in a convoy, there was the police car in the front. There was a second police car, the Beast, where the president is, in the Cadillac. There was another Italian police car, open in the back with two guys with black masks on and rifles sticking out the back. And I'm in the next car, and we're flying down via Conciliazione, the street that leads right into St. Peter's Square. And I'm thinking, oh no, no guns. We negotiated no guns. And there's the guys with the guns going in. And sure enough, right before we hit St. Peter's Square, they turned off, and we went in without the guys with the black masks and the guns. But everything was negotiated, and it was a challenge to deal with some of the people in the White House who wanted, we were discussing it at lunch today, some of the people in the White House at the National Security Agency wanted to have a video conference. We didn't have Zoom at that time, right?
No, not so much.
We wanted to have a video conference. And we said, the Vatican doesn't do video conferences. They said, no, look, we've got to work out the deliverables here. What are we going to get from the papal visit? And what are we going to get when President Obama comes in? I mean, there has to be a back and forth. And we said, well, they just don't do that kind of thing. But we'll check. And of course, we checked with Archbishop Gallagher, the Secretary of State, and he said, no, Ken, we don't do video conferences. Basically, let them come out, and we'll talk to them, and we'll be glad to talk to them, which they did, and everything worked out, and it was very much a success, both when President Obama visited in March of 2014, and the same was true when Pope Francis came to the United States. Everything was negotiated, except when Pope Francis came to the United States, what was negotiated was all changed at the last moment, which drove Vatican security crazy.
Yeah, I think some people would be surprised to know how involved the embassy would have gotten in a papal visit to the United States, but you were involved in a lot of conversations in the lead up.
Well, we were nervous that here was Pope Francis that, as far as we could gather, he had never spent any time in the United States or any length of time in the United States. So did he really understand our zeitgeist? We had heard him make a couple of faux pas on issues, on women's issues, and that made us nervous. Is he going to get it? What language is he going to speak in? Excuse me. I took the occasion to provide the person who I thought might write his speech in Congress with two books. One was by David Brooks, called The Road to Character, which traced, I don't know, 4 or 5 great Americans and what they did, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, I forget who the others were. And the second book was by Paul Ely, who's a professor at Georgetown, who wrote The Life You Saved May Be Your Own, the history of Dorothy Day, Flannery O'Connor, Thomas Merton, and one other. So there we are in Congress, watching the Pope open up his speech with, "Here I am in the home of the free and the land of the brave." Whoa, that's great. He's getting something here. And then he goes on to talk about great Americans like Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. And I'm thinking, oh, it worked. The book worked. The books worked. So that was kind of fun.
And it was really a feel-good moment for the U.S. Church in many ways.
Yeah.
After some years of not so good news.
No, I think he himself, Pope really enjoyed the visit. And as you say, it made Catholics proud to be Catholic because he represented something very special. Well, I'm a big Pope Francis fan, but he really made a worldwide impact and still makes a worldwide impact. Man of the Year and this or that magazine, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, he's controversial because he is really a Pope of the people. They talk about when he was the Archbishop in Buenos Aires. He used to go and visit his parishes on the bus. Never owned a car. He would just move with the people. And that's the same thing we saw, and we saw exhibited in Rome. You know, the Gucci loafers disappeared when he arrived. The limos disappeared. He drove around in a little Ford Escort in Rome, and then he used the little Fiat car when he came here. I mean, he's comfortable like that. And I don't know, that's all my years of working with the church around the world, that kind of person impressed me.
Secret Service wasn't quite as comfortable with
No.
with that close to the people
No.
approach. And when you heard about that, I think, too.
Yes, well, what happened was, from what I understand, we had worked a lot of the arrangement. There was a clear arrangement with the Secret Service, actually a signed document initialed by the Pope of what would happen during the papal visit to the United States. It was worked in detail every almost step of the way, from the visit to Washington, the visit to the White House, the visit to the cathedral. He was going to go to Catholic Charities Feeding Center. Everything was mapped out in New York, what he would do at the UN, et cetera, where he would stay, which road he would take. In Philadelphia, the same. And what happened is the whole event became elevated to a national security event. And from what I gather, Secret Service was kind of pushed aside, and the National Security Council took over the whole event. And therefore, other things happened that weren't expected or agreed upon. But we suffered a bit, Peter and I, when we had to go and meet with the Vatican security, the individual who had worked out all the details. And he felt just pushed aside. But anyway, it all was a success.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we heard when we got back to Rome, I mean, all the ambassadors wanted to talk to you to hear more about it. And it was a great moment, it seemed like. You know, we'll get to questions shortly, but one thing I want to ask you about, and sort of follows on from a little bit about how you appreciate Pope Francis' approach, being with the people and caring about the people. But one of the many things I think you did to make a real impact on the embassy and the Office of Ambassador was an added emphasis, giving both the State Department and I think even some Vatican offices a greater appreciation of the work of women religious around the world. Because we hadn't really talked about that in my previous tours as much as I think we should have.
Yeah.
And that was a great change, I think.
Well, my experience with Catholic Relief Services was oftentimes, where was the bed? Some group of nuns who would say, "Here, we'll stay with us here, and we'll give you a nice meal." And then over breakfast, you would find out all kinds of things that were going on, because the women religious knew stuff, and they knew it over a period of years. They had a historical context. So I had a deep appreciation for what they could offer. And we started working with the Association of Major Women Superiors internationally on issues like trafficking before the World Cup in Brazil, things like that. And we held a number of conferences on what they called the invisible power of women religious. There was not a big fuss. There wasn't a lot of pomp or circumstance. They just went about their business quietly and building peaceful relationships in many very tortured places. And so we tried to highlight that in the embassy and that work that was special. And also tried to connect people. That was another big thing we did. We found early in my tenure that on the issue of human trafficking, there were offices within the Vatican dealing with the issue of human trafficking that had never talked to each other. They didn't know what each was doing. And we found a way to bring them together and to share different experiences.
And I think people would also be surprised to know how much, I mean, we could be working with you. In the book, you talk about the work on South Sudan, for example, with the women religious who are based in Rome. And by your speaking to them and connecting them with our people in South Sudan, it can make a big difference.
No, that made an awful big difference. Solidarity with Southern Sudan was an effort that I had been, I had known about for a number of years, because back in around the year 2000, before South Sudan became independent, a group of men and women religious in Rome came up with the idea that we don't have enough Jesuits who can go to Sudan to start multiple schools. We don't have enough Cambonis or Ursulines or Maryknoll, because there just isn't enough of these clergy any longer. So what about if we had an organization where different religious orders, men and women, would work together for a single goal? Would it work? You know, there are issues about money and resources. Well, they started something called Solidarity with Southern Sudan, and it has done some wonderful, wonderful things. And it's an organization made up of various men and women religious of different talents. And then some religious communities have money, they offer money. Some have people, they offer people. And to work with them and to see what they were doing in Southern Sudan, but also the women religious working on issues of human trafficking and religious freedom was just magnificent.
So we talked a little bit about foreign policy, and you have a great section in the book about probably Pope Francis' most notable foreign policy work in helping with the rapprochement between Cuba and the United States. But getting to current topics a little bit, in the news, of course, has been Ukraine and Pope Francis's approach to Ukraine. And we've seen that he has been very careful. He's walked a fine line in what he's said about the conflict, his criticism of Russia and of President Putin. Has that surprised you at all? And do you think that it's changed a little bit during the course of the war? Do you see it changing at all as this war continues?
I don't know whether I could speculate on that. When the possibility of the Pope going to Ukraine was arised, and people asked me questions, but I thought it would be a great idea, a great symbolism. The Vatican historically didn't condemn terrible events. They always wanted to try to keep the door open for dialogue in some fashion. But I'll tell you, I was quite upset that he didn't say more against Russia. And, you know, he did say to Patriarch Kirill, who is the Russian Orthodox Patriarch in Moscow, don't be Putin's altar boy. And that was an overt criticism. And then he said some other things in his Angelus. But he hasn't really condemned. But as I read it, on many issues, there is no condemnation of Maduro in Venezuela, condemnation of Castro in Cuba. Even, I can't remember exactly what the Pope Benedict said about the Rwandan genocide. I'm sure he condemned the genocide. Did he condemn the people who perpetrated it? I don't recall. So there is always that hope of leaving the door open. There's going to be opportunities that we want to exploit. In the same way with China. I mean, they just signed another 2-year agreement with China about the appointment of bishops. Now, I don't know the substance of it, but it allows, in some measure, the Chinese government to have some say about the appointment of bishops. But that's not totally abnormal. There are concordats between the Vatican and states that go back many, many centuries, actually. I know that there's a concordat between the Vatican and Haiti about the appointment of bishops. I know there's one in Mozambique. I'm sure there are others in Europe as well, which would work in some kind of a balance where the government has some say in the recommendation of new bishops. But more than that, I don't really know.
No, I think, I think that the Pope, as you're saying, and that's been a constant, I think that Pope has wanted to keep the door open, even when we were there, President Putin, in one of his visits to the Vatican, kept the Pope waiting for over an hour. but the door's open so he can make a difference. So, well, why don't we see if there are any questions, because I have a few more I could intersperse, but I see some eager people, and I see some great experts in the back also. So we'll, I guess, recognize.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's wonderful to hear these stories about life in the Vatican. I worked at Vatican Radio during the Vatican Council. And I went through the same halls and met some of the key players back at that time. I'm Jim Weiss. I teach in the theology department. I'd like to turn the focus from the American ambassador to the Vatican's ambassadors. So this is a somewhat technical question, but you can explain the technicalities. At the beginning of his tenure, Pope Francis summoned all of the nuncios to Rome and made it quite clear that he wanted to reform the nunciature in various ways, especially in the selection of bishops. It has always remained a mystery to Vatican watchers that he has been so vigilant with the nuncio's ability to find candidates for bishoprics who match Francis's vision for the church, and the fact that he has left Cardinal Ouellet in charge of that dicastery, the dicastery that actually makes the recommendations to the Pope. Could you talk at least a little bit about how Francis has changed the Vatican diplomatic corps, and whether there is some kind of standoff between the nunciatures and the dicastery for bishops?
I can't speak to the issue of whether there's tension between the dicastery on the office of appointment of bishops in the Vatican and nuncios. I can say, and we used to have a very tight record of it, that Francis' appointments of cardinals have locked in the Francis legacy for at least another generation. I mean, he's appointed the majority now. I forget the exact number. On bishops, I think the nuncio in Washington, the current one, is just a gem. Very, very bright guy, and a quick study. So he is trying to find those people who are in the mold of Francis, and he's found it in McElroy, Supich, and a number of others. Yeah. Tobin and Sean O'Malley. And so he's made a stamp. He's left his stamp in the United States. Now, there is an overt side of the stamp, and there are those within the hierarchy here in the United States who are not that comfortable with Francis. But hey, that's life. And he is, the longer he stays, he will continue to appoint, and he will take these cardinals from the periphery. I mean, some of them you just say to yourself, wow, he's out there in, I don't know, Papua New Guinea or something like that. Yeah, but yeah, young cardinal from Mongolia. I mean, I don't know how many Catholics there are in Mongolia, but anyway.
Can I ask a follow-up? It was always the case that nuncios to certain countries were guaranteed to become cardinals after they finished their nunciatures. That's no longer the case.
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Has that demoralized the Vatican diplomatic corps? Because it used to be a stepping stone to the cardinal.
From what I can gather, the Vatican diplomatic corps is not demoralized by Francis. Now, we had when Francis invited all of the nuncios from around the world to the Vatican in 2014, I think was the first time it was done. We invited the 12 American citizen nuncios to the residence for a meeting, and they were all very upbeat. So I can't say more.
Any question?
Thank you so much for what you shared with us. I was going to ask you, what does an ambassador do? But listening to you, I discovered a few things. But what I wanted to know is, is your job, were you able to make it what you wanted it to be? Or, were you given specific things to do?
Well, ambassadors get instructions from Washington.
Oh, from where?
Washington.
From Washington.
Yes.
Oh,
ambassador works
okay,
for the
that's what
president.
I'm interested in hearing about that.
That happens every day. You're asked to carry, excuse me, a message. I'll give you a good example. There's this place called Guantanamo. It has some prisoners in it. And President Obama, when he was running for office, said he would like to close Guantanamo and move the prisoners out. And Congress firmly put up a wall that none of those prisoners would be imprisoned in the territory of the United States. Therefore, if they were going to be moved, they had to go elsewhere. Somebody in the State Department came up with the idea that, well, maybe some of the governments that we want to put the prisoners could be influenced by their bishops' conference or the Vatican. So send a message to that American ambassador out there in the Vatican. Tell him to get the Vatican to support this idea. So we brought it over, and first reaction was, this is a good idea to try to resettle the prisoners in Guantanamo. The Vatican was fully supportive of the concept. And then they said something that I kind of knew. They said that in some countries, I think one of them was Uruguay, and another was Paraguay, and maybe Albania, I forget exactly where they were. When the Vatican tells the bishops they'd like them to do something, the bishops say, yes, and how high do you want me to jump? And in other countries, the bishops say, yeah, maybe we'll get to that. And so, in fact, a number of prisoners were resettled because the bishops in the country that were going to resettle them agreed. And they brought it to their government, and there was an agreement, and they took prisoners. But not all. So that's the kind of thing you do every day. What else would we be? Well, the big thing we had to find out is go and find out what's involved with this encyclical Laudato Si. He's writing something about the environment. What is it? And that's where I brought Gina McCarthy out, the energy secretary. But we had, actually before the encyclical was published, I had a call from Al Gore. And he wanted to come out and advise the Vatican about what they should put in their encyclical. And there were many people like that. Generally, there are many people who, because they're good Catholics, have to see the Pope, or because they think themselves important, they have to see the Pope and tell the Pope something. So we dealt with a lot of them, including Harry Weinstein.
Ambassador Haskett, Peter said if I'd like to ask a question to go ahead and do so. So I have one concerning our time together in Rome. When I came with my director in policy planning at the State Department, we met you and went on to the Apostolic Palace. The main thing on the mind of the Subsecretario was the state of Christians in the Middle East. The Holy Father was very concerned that that was the height of the Syrian war, and they were emptying out of Syria and Iraq when the Islamic Caliphate ruled. So during your time in Rome, from behind the scenes, did you see any substantial progress on this matter? Because it's a concern it should be to every Catholic. This is the origins of Christianity in that part of the Middle East. Was there any progress made? Thank you.
Quite honestly, I didn't see much progress, but I mean, the Pope did visit, and that was a milestone. Remember, he went off script and he visited, I forget what it was, the Wailing Wall or something like that. And the Israeli ambassador to the Vatican said, following that, he said, "We were running around like crazy trying to figure out what the Pope is pulling off here and trying to balance it out with them." So that visit highlighted the condition of the Palestinian people, certainly. But was it lasting? John Kerry put an enormous amount of attention into trying to work a settlement for Middle East peace. I mean, basically, one time we were told that he would like to use my residence for a meeting between Netanyahu and who was it?
think Abbas.
Abu Mazen, Palestinian leader. And so my wife and I and the dog booked a hotel room, and we were going to clean out. They cleaned the street. They put extra security guards on the street. They put a sniper on the roof. And Netanyahu backed away from the meeting. We never had it.
Actually, if I may, I was asking about the Christians in Iraq and Syria, those who had fled the Islamic State. They were rapidly emptying, and I know the Pope went to where Abraham was from in Ur and Chaldeas, but that was much later. Was there any talk about them?
The Vatican was very concerned about Iraq. I mean, Cardinal Filoni, who headed the propagation of the faith, was the nuncio in Iraq all during the U.S. bombing and stayed there. He wanted to be with the people, as the Vatican encouraged. But you know, the outflow of people from Iraq, it just keeps coming. And there was a recent article last few days. What about us? What about the Iraqi refugees? The Ukrainians are getting a lot of attention right now. Are we forgotten? I would say that the Vatican is deeply concerned, but is somewhat incapable of doing much for the conditions of the Middle East Christians.
Thank you again for being here. I had a question about, so I'm in a class called Ethics, Religion, and International Politics, and I think overall the question of religion within international politics is fascinating because it is something separate from an individual country. So could you kind of talk about how you feel about, for example, the Catholic Church being an entity in not just one country, but many, and how that could either unite the world as a whole or kind of divided in a sense? I know you talked about leaving the door open sometimes to conversation, but do you think that's overall helpful because the Catholic Church is not tied to like a specific country, or is there something kind of more to that could?
Have you read the book Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft?
I have not.
Better.
Okay.
By Doug Johnson. And it addresses just this issue. Where does religion fit in the whole question of statecraft? And they take examples. One of the examples is the community of Sant'Egidio. If you've ever heard of it, it's based in Rome. And they work on peace issues around the world. They were instrumental in settling a peace in Mozambique between Renamo and the government back now 20 years. They had worked on peace in Central Africa. We supported them on peace efforts in Senegal. So there is a role, certainly, a vivid role for religion and all religions in the advancement of peace and building a better society. Now, there's a variety of characters who fit into this effort, like the nuns, who you don't hear much about. They're working on it at the community level. But others are great leaders and can speak to it. The Pope brought together, I think on 2 occasions, he brought the Israeli president and was it the head of Al-Aqsa?
Yeah, the head of the big mosque in
Yeah.
Cairo.
In Cairo, symbolically to show that, hey, we can appear together, we can do things together. There's opportunities. So from the Vatican side, from Pope Francis' side, it's a lot about symbolism. From the rest of the church's side, it's about action. So read that book.
Ambassador Hackett, thank you so much for your service, and thank you for being a great ambassador of Boston College in your work. Just a quick question. I teach in the Carroll School, and I advise so many of our excellent students are here. Your story about signing up with the Peace Corps, kind of on a whim, it sounded like, is so...
To that guy right there behind you.
It's so different from what our students think they have to do today to find a successful career path. Really, they almost start planning their career, right? You're nodding, right? Testify to my behalf, right? It's really, they start planning freshman year for the internship after sophomore year. Their life is so planned out that they're fearful if they don't have something secure by senior year almost. Could you speak to maybe the serendipity or the role that you think God might have played in your finding your path without being too controlling about it?
Yeah, I have a kind of Nike philosophy. Say a prayer and jump. I mean, it's not, you don't control everything. And to think you do is presumptuous. Things happen, things change. God intervenes in ways that you don't know about. I can't be very philosophical about the whole thing, but I think, gosh, if you're in your 20s, enjoy it. Do crazy things. Do different things. You don't need money in your 20s. You get by on a few bucks. Really, and well, that's my philosophy. Now, my son is an architect, and he's been planning to be an architect since he was like 10. So it doesn't pass all the way through the family, I'll tell you. Carmen?
I knew Ken as a classmate and teammate and a fraternity brother here at PC. And I knew that he was special. There was something about this guy that was special. And I think that's why we ended up going on to send you up to the Peace Corps and then back to the reserve. And speaking of Gucci loafers, I had seen Ken years later at graduating from DC, and I remember standing at Grand Central Station, speaking of Gucci loafers, I was wearing Gucci loafers. I had a nice suit on, and I had just come from living in Santa Monica, and was living in Rye, New York. And at Ken's core, he just looked at me and said, Carmen, you know, we had come from humble beginnings, the two of us. Not having a penny anymore at DC. And he just looked at me and said, people are starving in Africa. And people are at war all over the world. And he said, you just have to understand that. Thank you. I'll never forget it.
Thank you.
We probably have time just for one more question. So I don't know if anyone. Oh, right over here.
Yeah.
Very much for your talk, Ambassador. I had a very rather particular question. You mentioned that your time in the Peace Corps and Catholic Relief Services involved the Ethiopian famine and the Rwandan massacres and other still very infamous humanitarian crises. What sustained you during these times of troubles when you're dealing with such infamous events as these? Your faith and the faith of your colleagues especially.
There's a nun who works along the border, Sister Norma Pimentel. And a few years ago, I heard her say, faith is easy, religion is tough. So during all these events, there was an element of religious tension that was really difficult to deal with in Bosnia, in Ethiopia. Even though it was a famine, there was an overlay of other factors. So I'd say it was my faith that sustained me. I mean, oh boy, I remember the discussions with my staff about where is God? Look, we just came back from seeing 5,000 bodies. Where's God? And I don't know, I wasn't the theologian or the philosopher to deal with that. And it was powerful trying to deal with it. I'd say it was my faith, as simple as it is, not complicated faith. But I think that's what it was.
Ambassador Hackett and Peter, thank you so much for this conversation.